Keanu Reeves was not the kind of celebrity who liked attention. Even though he was one of the most famous actors in the world, he lived a very simple life. He did not walk around with bodyguards, and he did not expect people to treat him like a superstar. Most of the time, he wanted to be seen as just a normal person. That was why he often went out quietly, wearing plain clothes, and moved in places where people did not notice him. One afternoon, he decided to pay a visit to one of his own motorcycle stores. He had always loved motorcycles deeply, and he wanted to check the latest designs himself without making it a big deal. When he walked into the store, he was dressed in old jeans, a black jacket, and worn-out boots. His hair was tied back, and he wore no flashy watch or expensive jewelry. To anyone who didn't know him closely, he looked like an ordinary man in his mid-50s who simply loved bikes. The store was busy at that time. Some customers were browsing, while others were speaking with the staff. Everyone was focused on their own business, and nobody turned to give him special attention. That was exactly how Keanu liked it. He enjoyed being invisible, because then he could move freely without people crowding around him. He walked slowly past the rows of motorcycles, running his hand lightly over the shiny metal. Each bike had a story. Some were brand new models built with the latest technology, while others had a raw, powerful design that made them look like beasts waiting to roar. Keanu stopped at one particular bike. It was sleek, black, and heavy, with strong lines that showed strength but also style. His eyes brightened. He bent down, carefully inspecting the details, noticing things only a true motorcycle lover would. For him, it was not just a machine. It was art, a living piece of work. As he was admiring the bike, he approached the counter and asked a question to a staff member about the engine specifications. The staff member, who was younger and already stressed from handling too many people at once, barely looked at him. He thought Keanu was just another curious visitor who had no serious intention of buying anything. With a quick, dismissive tone, the staff member told him to check the brochure instead. Keanu nodded politely, not showing the slightest irritation. He had dealt with far worse situations in life, and this was nothing to him. Still, a few people nearby noticed the cold way the staff had spoken and felt a little awkward. Keanu did not react. He simply walked over to another section of the store, quietly flipping through a catalog. He asked another question, this time about customization options. Again, the response was sharp and unkind, almost as if he was wasting the workers' time. Most people in that position might have gotten angry or raised their voice, but Keanu did not. He gave a small smile, thanked the worker, and continued to explore the shop as if nothing had happened. This calmness in him was unusual, and it drew the attention of a few other customers. They started whispering among themselves, wondering who this man was. He carried himself with quiet confidence, yet he didn't try to show off. There was something different about him, something that made people look twice. Still, nobody had realized yet that it was Keanu Reeves, the star of movies they had all watched on screen. To them, he was just a man who seemed too polite, even when being ignored. For Keanu, moments like this were interesting. They showed him how people treated strangers when they thought no one was watching. Fame, he knew, was a mask. People often behaved nicely only because of who he was. But when they didn't recognize him, he got to see their real nature. And in a way, he preferred it like this. It kept him grounded. It reminded him of the importance of humility, both in himself and in others. As he continued to look at the motorcycles, Keanu remembered the days when he was younger, when buying even a second-hand bike had felt like a dream. He had worked hard, saved money, and fallen in love with the freedom motorcycles gave him. That passion had led him to start his own motorcycle company years later. The store he was now standing in was a result of that dream. He had built it so that people could share the same love for bikes as he did. And yet, here he was, treated as though he didn't belong. He found the situation almost funny. He had entered quietly, hoping for peace, and instead he had been disrespected in his own store. But his calm nature did not allow him to take offense. Instead, he decided to continue walking around, carefully observing both the bikes and the people. He noticed how other customers were treated, how some got attention while others were brushed aside. In his heart, he made a quiet decision. Something needed to change in the way his staff treated visitors. Everyone, whether rich or poor, famous or not, deserved kindness. What no one in that store realized yet was that the man walking among them, silent, humble, and patient, was about to teach them all an unforgettable lesson. They had no idea that the ordinary-looking man was actually the owner himself, and even more shocking, a Hollywood legend. And soon, everything in that store was going to change. The store was full of energy that day. Customers walked in and out, some admiring the motorcycles, some asking about prices, and others just looking around without any intention to buy. The younger staff members were moving quickly, trying to help everyone. One of them, a boy in his 20s, was clearly stressed. His tone was sharp, his movements restless, and he had no patience for anyone who looked like they were wasting time. When Keanu Reeves walked toward him with a gentle smile, the boy didn't even lift his head properly. Keanu asked politely about the motorcycle he had just seen, wanting to know about the engine type and how it performed on long rides. Instead of answering kindly, the staff member sighed loudly, as if Keanu's question was annoying. He pointed roughly toward a brochure on the counter and muttered, "It's all there. You can read." His eyes went straight back to his phone screen, checking messages instead of showing interest in the customer in front of him. Keanu did not react. His face showed no anger, no irritation. He only nodded, picked up the brochure, and said softly, "Thank you." He stood aside and began flipping through the pages. To anyone watching, it seemed like he was just another quiet man who didn't know how to demand respect. A few customers who noticed the exchange shook their heads in disapproval. They thought the staff member was rude, but nobody wanted to step in. Moments later, Keanu approached another staff worker at the display section. He had found another bike that caught his interest, a model with bold red paint and smooth design. Again, his voice was soft, filled with curiosity. "Excuse me, could you tell me about the customization options for this one?" he asked. The staff member barely gave him a glance. With an impatient tone, he replied, "We're busy right now. If you're not ready to buy, please let others look." His words hung in the air like a slap. The few people nearby felt the sting of that reply. They looked at Keanu, waiting for him to snap back, maybe to raise his voice or demand better service. After all, most men would not have tolerated such disrespect. But Keanu only smiled faintly, as if the rude words had never touched him. He whispered, "All right," and moved a little to the side. Some customers began whispering, "Why are they treating him like this?" One man said quietly to his friend, "He's being so polite." Another shook his head and replied, "They think he's nobody. Look at his simple clothes, no attitude. They don't know who he is." The disrespect did not stop there. A third staff member walked by and almost pushed Keanu aside while carrying some items. "Move, sir. You're blocking the way," the man said harshly, not even making eye contact. Keanu stepped back quickly and apologized as if it was his fault. His humility only deepened the curiosity of the people watching. Why was this man so calm and respectful, being treated with such carelessness? What no one understood in that moment was Keanu's nature. He had lived through pain and loss in his life. He had faced struggles much greater than a few rude words in a store. That was why he never let anger control him. Instead of fighting back, he preferred to respond with patience. To him, the situation was almost a chance to see how people acted when they thought they had power over someone who looked ordinary. Meanwhile, the rude staff continued their work without realizing the truth. They thought Keanu was just another window shopper, someone who had no intention of buying a motorcycle. Their words were sharp, their faces cold, and their tone careless. But every disrespectful act was slowly building tension in the store. Customers who noticed the behavior began feeling uneasy. They could sense that something important was about to happen, even if they didn't know what. Keanu, however, remained calm. He leaned against the counter, still studying the catalog, his eyes scanning every page with quiet interest. He asked no more questions for the moment, but deep inside he was thinking. This was his own store. He had built it so that people could share his love for motorcycles. He wanted the place to be a welcoming space for everyone, rich or poor, famous or unknown. Yet here he was, experiencing the very opposite. His staff was showing arrogance, and they were forgetting the first rule of kindness. Respect every customer. The disrespectful attitude of the workers was not just hurting him personally. It was damaging the spirit of the place he had created. He felt a mix of sadness and disappointment, but he hid it behind his usual calm smile. To anyone watching, he looked like a man too gentle to complain. But the truth was different. Keanu was silently waiting. He did not believe in punishing people with anger. He believed in teaching lessons through actions, not loud words. And in his heart, he knew there would be a moment soon when the truth would come out. When that happened, everyone in the store, the staff, the customers, and even the people who had whispered in surprise would see who he really was. And they would also see what true kindness looked like, even in the face of open disrespect. That day in the store, the staff thought they had pushed aside just another customer. But in reality, they were standing in front of the owner himself, one of the most respected actors in the world. The disrespect they had shown would soon turn into one of the greatest lessons of their lives. Keanu stood quietly in the store, holding the catalog in his hand. The harsh words and rude behavior from the staff did not seem to trouble him at all. Where another man might have shouted, demanded respect, or even walked out in anger, Keanu chose a different path. His calmness was unusual, almost strange, and it caught the attention of the people who were watching. He was not just being quiet because he was shy. He was showing a kind of patience that very few people had. He moved slowly around the shop, stopping to look at the motorcycles again. Every time he leaned forward to check the details of a bike, his eyes lit up like a child who had just found a toy he loved. It was clear that this man cared deeply for motorcycles, but what stood out even more was his politeness. He never raised his voice, never pushed anyone aside, and always waited until a staff member was free before asking another question. Even when they responded rudely, he nodded, thanked them, and walked away without complaint. The store was busy. But little by little, some customers started noticing the unusual scene. They whispered to each other, curious about this man who was so patient. One woman told her husband, "Look at him. They are being rude, but he doesn't even frown." Another customer added, "He acts like he has all the time in the world. Who does that these days?" Slowly, more people began to watch him instead of the motorcycles. Keanu did not mind being ignored or dismissed. In fact, he almost welcomed it. To him, it was a reminder of how ordinary life really was when fame was not involved. He knew that most of the time, when people recognized him, they treated him differently, sometimes with too much respect, sometimes with too much fear. But here, where no one knew who he really was, he was experiencing life like any other man. He was seeing how people behaved when they thought the person in front of them had nothing special. There was a quiet wisdom in his calm reaction. He believed that anger only created more anger. If he had shouted or demanded attention, the staff might have become defensive, and the moment would have turned into an ugly fight. Instead, he stayed gentle, and his behavior began to stir something in the people watching. They were reminded that kindness and patience could exist, even when someone was treated badly. After a while, Keanu walked to a corner of the shop where a beautiful silver motorcycle was displayed. He crouched down, looking closely at the engine, the wheels, and the smooth finish of the paint. For him, it was not just about the price or the look, it was about the craft and the effort put into making it. He whispered softly to himself, admiring the design. A boy nearby, standing with his father, heard him and came closer. The boy asked, "Do you like that one, mister?" Keanu turned, smiled warmly, and replied, "Yes, I think it's wonderful. Motorcycles have a soul, you know? Each one tells a story." The boy smiled back, though he still had no idea who this kind man was. At the counter, the staff continued their work, still unaware of the truth. The young worker who had been rude earlier was now laughing with another employee, talking about how some customers wasted time asking questions but never bought anything. They pointed in Keanu's direction, not realizing their mistake. A few customers frowned when they heard this. They didn't like the way the workers spoke, but nobody said anything. They were all waiting to see how the quiet man would react. But Keanu didn't react. He only gave a gentle smile and walked toward another motorcycle. His calm presence made the atmosphere in the shop strangely heavy, as if something big was about to happen. Some people felt almost guilty just for watching. They wondered how a man could take so much disrespect and still remain so peaceful. The truth was, Keanu had lived through things far more painful than rude words. He'd faced the loss of loved ones, had dealt with heartbreak and loneliness. And yet, he never let bitterness control him. That was why a simple moment of disrespect in a store could not break his calm. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity to practice patience and to show others that anger was not the only answer. As he stood quietly by another bike, a customer finally whispered to her friend, "I think I know who he is." Her friend looked confused. She leaned closer and said, "That's Keanu Reeves. I'm sure of it." Her friend's eyes widened, and slowly the word began to spread among the customers. One by one, they started recognizing him. They looked at his face more carefully, and then they knew the quiet man who was being treated so poorly was a world-famous actor. Still, Keanu acted as though nothing had changed. He was just as polite, just as calm, and just as patient as before. He smiled at a little girl who peeked at him from behind her mother, and he nodded at an older man who gave him a respectful nod in return. Everyone who realized who he was began to feel a mix of shock and admiration. They had expected him to be arrogant or demanding, but instead, he was the most humble man in the room at that moment. The atmosphere of the store changed completely. The customers grew silent, watching closely and waiting for what would happen next. The staff, still unaware, continued behaving carelessly. But it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and when it did, it would leave everyone in that shop completely stunned. The air inside the store was beginning to change. Even though the staff had not yet noticed it, customers had started whispering among themselves. Some were pointing at Keanu, others staring longer than before. A few of them were already certain who he was, while others were still unsure. But one thing was clear. There was something unusual about this man. His calmness, his quiet smile, and the way he carried himself all felt different from an ordinary visitor. Then, the moment came that shifted everything. An older employee entered the store. He had worked with motorcycles for decades and knew the history of the company very well. As soon as his eyes landed on Keanu, he froze for a second. His expression changed from casual to shocked, and then to delighted. He walked quickly across the store, ignoring everyone else, and went straight to the quiet man standing by the silver motorcycle. "Mr. Reeves," the older man said, his voice filled with surprise and respect. "What an honor to see you here." Today, the sound of those words cut through the entire shop like a bell. Heads turned immediately. Customers who had doubted now knew the truth. The man they had been watching quietly, the man who had been disrespected again and again, was none other than Keanu Reeves himself, the owner of the store, and one of the most famous actors in the world. The rude staff members froze. The young worker who had dismissed him earlier nearly dropped the paperwork he was holding. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His face turned pale, and he stared in disbelief. The second worker, the one who had told him not to waste time, looked down, suddenly ashamed. The room grew so silent that even the sound of footsteps felt loud. Keanu smiled warmly at the older employee. "It's good to see you again," he said softly. His voice was calm, without any sign of pride or anger. The older man shook his hand firmly, and then looked around at the rest of the staff. "Do you all realize who this is?" he asked. "This is Mr. Reeves. Without him, none of us would even be standing in this store. He built this." Gasps filled the air. Customers whispered in excitement, and a few even pulled out their phones, though most were too shocked to move. The staff who had been rude earlier now felt as if the ground had been pulled from under their feet. They had treated their own boss and a world-renowned star like a nobody. Their faces burned with shame. One woman standing near the display whispered to her son, "Do you know who that is?" "That's Keanu Reeves, the movie star." The boy's eyes widened in awe. He had seen Keanu in films before, but never imagined meeting him in real life, especially not in such a simple setting. Other customers began to smile and nod at Keanu, some out of respect, some out of admiration, and some simply because they were in disbelief. All eyes were now fixed on him. But what shocked everyone even more was not his identity, was his reaction. He did not scold the workers. He did not demand an apology. Instead, he gave the same gentle smile he had worn all along, as if nothing had changed. He reached out his hand to the staff member who had been rude earlier. The young man hesitated, his face red with embarrassment. But Keanu spoke softly. "It's all right. We all have tough days." Those words landed heavily on everyone listening. No one expected kindness in that moment. Most people thought he would be angry, maybe even fire the workers on the spot. But instead, Keanu chose forgiveness. The staff member's hands shook as he accepted the handshake, mumbling a quiet, "I'm sorry." Keanu simply nodded. The customers looked at each other in amazement. Here was a man with every reason to be upset, yet he chose to show patience and humility. The story unfolding in front of them felt more powerful than any scene from a movie. It was real. It was human. And it was unforgettable. The store, which had been filled with tension, slowly filled with warmth. People smiled, whispered excitedly, and watched every move Keanu made. Some even began to clap quietly, though they were unsure if it was appropriate. The older employee, still standing proudly next to him, explained to the customers about Keanu's passion for motorcycles, how he personally checked on the designs, and how he had started the company out of love, not just for business. The customers listened with respect, their admiration growing with every word. Meanwhile, young staff stood silently, their pride broken but their hearts learning a valuable lesson. They realized that they had judged a man by his appearance. By his simple clothes and quiet nature, they had forgotten the basic rule of treating everyone with respect. And now, they were standing face to face with the consequences. But instead of punishment, they received something else, an example. Keanu Reeves had shown them that power and fame did not need to be loud. True strength was in staying calm, even When disrespected, true greatness was in showing kindness when anger would have been easier. As he continued to move around the store, customers began approaching him, shyly at first, then with more courage. Some asked for autographs, others for photos, and Keanu agreed to each request with patience. The little boy from earlier ran up again, smiling widely, and Keanu bent down to shake his hand, making the child feel like the most important person in the room. By now, the rude staff members could only watch in silence, their shame growing heavier with every passing minute. But in their hearts, they also felt something else, a sense of gratitude. They had been given a lesson they would never forget, not through anger or humiliation, but through kindness and forgiveness. And as the truth of who he was settled over the store, everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare, a moment when humility shined brighter than fame, and patience became the most powerful response of all. The store had fallen into complete silence after the truth came out. Everyone now knew that the quiet man in plain clothes was none other than Keanu Reeves himself. The rude staff members stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shame. They had treated their own boss, a Hollywood legend, like he was nothing more than a time waster. Customers held their breath, waiting for Keanu's reaction. They expected anger. They expected loud words, maybe even firings on the spot. But what he did instead shocked everyone. Keanu simply smiled. It wasn't a fake smile or one meant to hide. Anger, it was calm, warm, and forgiving. He turned to the staff member who had first dismissed him and held out his hand. The young man stared at it, unable to move, his heart pounding. He whispered, I'm so sorry." His voice cracked under the weight of guilt, but Keanu only replied softly, "It's all right. We all have hard days." His tone carried no anger, no insult, only understanding. The customers could hardly believe it. They had seen many rich people lose their temper over the smallest inconveniences. Yet here was a man, one of the most famous in the world, forgiving disrespect as if it were nothing. That single gesture, offering kindness instead of punishments, spoke louder than any speech. The other staff member, the one who had told Keanu not to waste time, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, I didn't know. I shouldn't have spoken." That way, he couldn't meet Keanu's eyes. But Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder and said gently, "Respect is important. Not just for me, but for everyone who walks in here. Remember that?" His voice was calm, almost fatherly. The man nodded, feeling both guilty and grateful at the same time. A wave of relief swept through the room, but it was mixed with awe. People had expected drama, maybe even humiliation for the workers, but Keanu gave them something else, a lesson. The customers looked at each other, their respect for him growing with every passing moment. It was clear that Keanu Reeves was different from most celebrities. He didn't carry pride like a weapon. He carried humility like a shield to lighten the heavy mood. Keanu even cracked a small joke. Looking around at the motorcycles, he said, "Well, at least you didn't kick me out before I could admire the bikes." The crowd laughed softly, and even the embarrassed staff members managed weak smiles. The tension slowly melted away, replaced by a strange mix of respect, relief, and admiration. For Keanu, this was never about revenge. He had no desire to embarrass anyone. What mattered to him was sending a message that kindness had more power than anger. He knew that in that one moment, every person in the room had learned something important. The customers started clapping, unable to hold back their admiration any longer. A small group applauded first, then the whole store joined in. The sound filled the air, echoing against the walls. And for a moment, the shop felt less like a business and more like a place of inspiration. Keanu raised his hand slightly, asking them to calm down, and gave a shy smile, almost embarrassed by the attention. The young staff members stood there, their hearts heavy, but also strangely lifted. They had made a mistake, a big one, but instead of punishment, they received forgiveness. That forgiveness was not just a relief, it was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They realized they had been wrong, not only because Keanu was their boss, but because they should have treated every customer with respect, no matter who they were. As things settled, Keanu walked back to the silver motorcycle he had admired earlier. He ran his hand gently along its smooth surface and said quietly, "This one is beautiful. Whoever designed it has real talent." His words were sincere, not meant to impress anyone. The older employee standing beside him nodded with pride. Feeling grateful that Keanu had noticed the hard work put into the bike, some customers began approaching him one by one. A mother asked if he would take a picture with her son, and Keanu agreed immediately, kneeling down to the boy's height so the photo would look perfect. Another man asked for an autograph, and Keanu signed with a smile. Each interaction showed the same thing: his patience and humility never faded. No matter how many people asked, the rude staff members watched all of this in silence. They realized that the man they had treated so poorly was not only their boss, not only a star, but also someone with a heart larger than his fame. They felt a deep regret, but also a strange hope, because if he could forgive them, maybe they could change too. The store, once noisy and full of casual chatter, now felt like a sacred place where everyone had witnessed something rare. A man, disrespected, had chosen not to strike back, but to forgive. A celebrity had chosen not to flaunt his power, but to remain humble. And that choice had changed the atmosphere completely. Keanu's surprising response was more powerful than any anger could have been. It taught everyone present that real strength is not in shouting or punishing. It is in staying calm when you have every reason to be angry. It is in showing kindness when the world expects you to strike back. By the time Keanu moved toward the exit, people were still staring at him, their hearts touched. The staff stood straighter, more aware, silently promising themselves they would never repeat their mistake again. The customers, too, walked out later with a story they knew they would share with friends and family, and all of them, whether staff or customer, carried the same thought in their hearts. They had just seen a living example of humility, a lesson that would stay with them forever. The store was still buzzing with whispers after Keanu's calm response. People could not stop talking about how he had handled the situation. Customers glanced at him with admiration, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The rude staff members stood quietly, their shame still heavy on their faces, but in their hearts, something had already begun to change. What Keanu did next would turn the entire moment into an unforgettable lesson. Keanu stood in the middle of the shop and looked around at the people. He was not angry, not even disappointed anymore. His face carried only a gentle seriousness. He spoke in a low, steady voice, but every word carried weight. "Respect," he began softly, "is not about who someone is. It's about who we are when we meet them." His words reached every corner of the room. People stopped moving, stopped speaking, and listened carefully. He continued, "It doesn't matter if a person is rich, poor, famous, or a stranger. You never know who is standing in front of you. It could be someone important, or it could be someone who has nothing. But every human being deserves kindness." His voice was not lecturing. It was gentle, as if he was sharing wisdom from his own life. The customers nodded slowly, while the staff looked down at the floor, realizing how badly they had failed that simple rule. Keanu glanced at the young worker who had first dismissed him. "When I came in," he said, "you didn't know me. You thought I was just another man walking around. That's fine. But the way you treated me, that's what matters. Because it shows not how you see me, but who you are inside." The young man swallowed hard. He felt those words pierce his heart. He wanted to apologize again, but the shame was too strong. Then Keanu looked at all the staff together. "A store like this," he said, "is not just about selling motorcycles. It's about making people feel welcome. Someone might come here after saving money for years just to touch one of these bikes. Another person might come only to dream. And even if they can't buy anything, they still deserve respect." His words were simple, but they carried a truth that everyone in the shop could feel. The customers looked at him with admiration. One woman whispered to her husband, "It feels like he's not just talking to them, he's talking to all of us." Her husband nodded in agreement. Even the children in the store seemed to understand the message, watching Keanu with wide eyes as he spoke. Keanu's own life had taught him humility. He knew the pain of loss, the weight of struggles, and the loneliness of being treated unfairly. That was why he believed so strongly in kindness. In that store, in that moment, he wanted to remind everyone that humanity was more important than fame, money, or pride. As he spoke, the embarrassed staff members began to lift their heads. They saw that he wasn't trying to humiliate them. He wasn't scolding them like a strict teacher. Instead, he was guiding them, giving them a chance to learn and become better. The young worker who had been rudest felt tears forming in his eyes. For the first time in his job, he realized what customer service really meant. Keanu ended his words with a soft smile. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after." Then he nodded gently and stepped back, letting his message sink into the hearts of everyone in the room. The store stayed quiet for a long moment. People looked at each other, moved by what they had just heard. Then, one by one, they began to clap again. This time, it wasn't just for Keanu, the actor. It was for Keanu, the human being. The man who had turned a simple moment of disrespect into a lesson in humility. The staff members, though still embarrassed, began to breathe easier. They realized they had been given something rare: forgiveness, and a chance to change. They would never forget those words, and they knew from that day forward, they would treat every customer differently. Even the customers walked away with a lesson. A man whispered to his friend, "I came here to look at bikes, but I'm leaving with something bigger, reminder of how I should treat people." Another customer added, "That's why Keanu is loved everywhere. It's not the movies, it's his heart." The atmosphere in the shop was no longer heavy with shame. It was lighter, almost peaceful. People smiled at each other, strangers nodded in respect, and there was a quiet warmth in the air. Keanu's words had touched everyone, not just the staff, but the customers too. Before leaving the spot where he had spoken, Keanu looked once more at the motorcycles, then back at the people. His smile grew a little wider, and he said half-jokingly, "Well, I guess I'll have to come more often to remind everyone about kindness." The crowd laughed softly, and the tension finally broke. But deep inside, every person there knew they had been part of something rare. They had not just witnessed a celebrity moment, they had seen a man, disrespected in his own store, turn the situation into a timeless lesson about respect and humanity. And long after they left the shop, those words would remain in their hearts, guiding them in their own lives. After sharing his words of wisdom, Keanu could have easily left the store and gone on with his day. But he was not finished yet. He wanted to turn the moment into something even more meaningful, something that would stay in the minds of everyone who was there. What he did next left the crowd completely speechless and gave them a story they would never forget. Keanu walked back to the silver motorcycle he had admired earlier. He bent down once more, running his hand along the polished frame, his eyes lighting up like a boy staring at his first bike. The customers watched him closely, wondering if he would buy it for himself. The embarrassed staff members stood silently in the background, still too ashamed to move. Then Keanu turned to the older employee, the one who had recognized him, and asked with a smile, "How much is this one?" The older man quickly told him the price. The customers thought Keanu would simply nod and maybe arrange to take it home. Instead, he surprised everyone by saying, "I'll take it, but not for me. I want it donated." His words hung in the air, confusing the staff and shocking the customers. Donated. Someone whispered. "What does he mean?" Keanu explained. Softly, "There are always people in need. Let's turn this bike into something good. Hold a charity raffle. Sell tickets at a small price so everyone has a chance. Let the money go to children who need food, education, or shelter." His voice was calm, but filled with determination. The store went completely quiet. Even the sound of the city outside seemed to fade away. People looked at each other, stunned. They had expected him to react with anger earlier, but instead he had chosen patience. Now, when he had the chance to spend his money on himself, he chose to help others. Customers began whispering, their voices full of admiration. "Did you hear that? He's donating it." One man said. Another added, "Who does that?" "Only." Keanu, the older employee, nodded proudly and quickly began to write down the details of the purchase. The rude staff members lowered their heads further. They had not only disrespected their boss, but also a man who was showing more generosity than they had ever seen in their lives. Their shame deepened, but so did their respect. But Keanu was not finished. He looked at the young worker who had first dismissed him and said, "And you help organize it. Take part in the raffle. Make sure the children who need help get the money." The young man's throat tightened. He expected anger, maybe punishment, but instead he was being trusted with something important. He nodded quickly, his eyes wet with tears, and whispered, "Yes, sir, I will." The second staff member, who had told him not to waste time, also stepped forward, guilt written all over his face. Keanu looked at him kindly and said, "You, too. Help spread the word. Make sure this isn't just about selling a bike, but about giving hope." The man's lips trembled as he said, "I will, sir, I promise." Then came another shock. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out some cash. He handed it to the same young worker who had been the rudest earlier. "Here," he said softly. "Take this as a tip." The young man's eyes widened. He shook his head quickly. "No, sir, I can't take it." "Not after," but Keanu insisted, placing the money gently in his hand. "It's not about what happened," he said. "It's about moving forward. Learn from it, do better." The boy's hands shook as he clutched the money, not because of its value, but because of the message behind it. Everyone watching felt a lump in their throat. Keanu was not just forgiving, he was lifting the young man up, giving him a chance to change, showing him that kindness could heal even the deepest shame. By now, the customers were in awe. They had walked into a motorcycle shop expecting to browse bikes, but they were witnessing a moment that felt bigger than life itself. They saw humility, forgiveness, and now generosity that reached far beyond the walls of the store. Some clapped. Some smiled through tears, and some just stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. One woman whispered to her daughter, "Remember this? This is what it means to be a good person." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Keanu didn't make a big show of it. He didn't raise his voice, didn't boast about what he was doing. He spoke simply, with the same calmness he had shown from the start. But that simplicity made it even more powerful. His actions spoke louder than any speech could. As the purchase was completed and the plan for the raffle was set, the store seemed transformed. Where there had once been tension and disrespect, now there was warmth, hope, and unity. Customers began talking excitedly about buying raffle tickets. Some even offered to spread the word to friends and family. The staff, still shaken, now felt motivated to do better. Inspired by the man they had once treated poorly, Keanu looked around one last time and gave a small smile. "Kindness doesn't cost much," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "But its value is endless." Those words settled deeply in the hearts of everyone there. The staff members, humbled and grateful, silently promised themselves they would never forget this day. The customers left with stories they knew they would share with everyone they knew. And the motorcycle, once just a machine, had now become a symbol of generosity, carrying with it a message that would change lives far beyond the walls of the store. The story did not end inside the store. In fact, it was only the beginning. When Keanu Reeves walked out of the motorcycle shop that day, the customers and staff were left standing in silence, their hearts full. They had just seen something they would never forget. But soon, the world outside would also hear about it. One of the customers, a young woman, pulled out her phone and posted about the incident online. She wrote about how Keanu had been disrespected in his own store, how he stayed calm, forgave the staff, and then donated a motorcycle for charity. She described his smile, his gentle words, and the way he treated even the rudest staff member with kindness. She ended her post with a simple line: "This is why Keanu Reeves is different. This is why the world loves him." The post spread quickly. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. Other customers who had been there also shared their own stories, each one adding new details: how Keanu had spoken about respect, how he tipped the rude staff member, how he chose generosity when he could have chosen anger. Soon, news outlets picked it up. Headlines appeared everywhere: "Keanu Reeves forgives and inspires in motorcycle shop incident." Disrespected in his own store, Keanu chooses kindness. Hollywood star teaches the world a lesson in humility. The story touched millions of people. Comments poured in on social media. Some people said they were not surprised because Keanu had always been known for his humble nature. Others said the story brought them to tears, reminding them that true greatness was not in fame, but in kindness. Strangers online promised to treat others with more respect after reading what happened. Back at the store, things also changed forever. The young staff members who had spoken rudely could not stop thinking about that day. They replayed it over and over in their minds, the moment they dismissed him, the moment they realized who he was, and the moment he forgave them. Each memory carried a sting of shame, but also a spark of hope. They knew they had been given a second chance. From that day forward, they greeted every customer with warmth, no matter how they looked. They remembered Keanu's words: "Respect is not about who someone is. It's about who we are when we meet them." The raffle for the motorcycle was organized quickly. Posters were made, tickets were sold, and the story of Keanu's generosity became part of the campaign. People lined up not just because of the chance to win the bike, but because they wanted to be part of the kindness. The money raised went to children in need, just as Keanu had asked. For many families, the funds brought food, school supplies, and medical care. The motorcycle became more than a machine, it became a symbol of hope. Meanwhile, the young worker who had been the rudest carried the memory deeper than anyone else. He often told friends, "I spoke badly to Keanu Reeves. He could have humiliated me, but instead he forgave me and gave me a chance." His voice always shook when he spoke about it. He knew it had changed him forever. He became more patient, more respectful, not just at work, but in his personal life too. As for the customers who were there that day, they each carried the story into the world. One mother told her children at dinner, "Kindness is stronger than anger. If you want to know what that looks like, remember Keanu Reeves." A man told his coworkers, "I saw humility with my own eyes. It wasn't in a book or a movie, it was real." The story spread through word of mouth just as much as it did online, touching lives far beyond the walls of that shop. Keanu himself did not talk about it publicly. He never made a statement, never tried to use the story for publicity. That was what made it even more powerful. He simply lived his life as usual, quiet and humble, while the world celebrated his actions. People admired not only what he did, but also the fact that he did not boast about it. He didn't need to. His actions were enough. In the weeks that followed, more and more people began to see Keanu not just as an actor, but as a role model. His movies were famous, but his kindness was what truly inspired hearts. Fans online wrote messages like, "Be like Keanu," and "The world needs more people like him." Teachers used the story in classrooms to teach children about respect and humility. Motivational speakers shared it in talks, reminding people that true strength was in forgiveness. And so, what started as a small, uncomfortable moment in a motorcycle store became a story told around the world. It was not a story of anger or revenge. It was a story of patience, forgiveness, and generosity. It was proof that even in a world often filled with pride and ego, there were still people who chose a different path. Keanu Reeves had been disrespected in his own store. He could have walked away in anger, or punished the staff, or demanded attention. But instead, he chose to forgive, to teach, and to give. And in doing so, he turned an ordinary day into an extraordinary lesson for everyone who witnessed it and for millions who later heard about it. Years from now, the customers, the staff, and even strangers who read the story would still remember it. They would remember the quiet man in simple clothes who showed that kindness is stronger than anger, that forgiveness is more powerful than pride, and that true greatness is not in fame, but in humility.